watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on the historicity of Luke's census. Now, what do I mean when I say Luke's census? Well, when you read the Gospel of Luke, 2nd chapter, he talks about this census that occurred throughout the Roman Empire. And the troubling concern here is that there is little to no corroborating evidence of a census occurring when Quirinius was governor of Syria when Jesus was born. So we've got a tricky, difficult subject here. We're going to delve into the weeds, but and I'm going to review the problem. I'll review proposals to how to solve this problem, and then I will be providing a new proposal that was published by an author at Cambridge University. And her name is Sabine Huebner, so I'll be sharing her research from her book. We'll get into that. I'll show you the book. Great book. The one chapter where she deals with the census is worth the price of the entire book. I'll tell you that. So I would strongly encourage people to check out that book. I'll get to the name of it a few moments away from here. So again, tricky subject, the census. Why is this a tricky issue? Well, let's review the biblical text as we jump right into the issue on today's program. Luke chapter 2 says, "In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered." This should be, every Christian should know this story, right? If you ever went to like a Christmas pageant or Christmas play or whatever you want to call it, if you go to church around Christmas time, this is always, when we are concerned about smashing the Gospels together to create a harmony of the Gospels. You've got Matthew's infancy narrative with Luke's infancy narrative, and you have just this big, huge meta story being told at churches every Christmas. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary his betrothed, who was with child. Well, why is this such a tricky issue? Well, let me share with you some objections from a popular, well-known critic, Bart Ehrman, and then I'll share a quote from a moderate scholar, Robert Stein, on the issue, and then we'll jump into the solution. And I see Amber, who's watching us today. Yay, she made it. She's a few weeks has missed. We've missed having you, Amber, but you say Dr. J is going to fix it. Well, I don't take credit for this one. This will be Sabine Huebner who offers the solution that I really think knocks it out of the park. It's not just a home run. I think it's a grand slam. Now, maybe I'm making too high of expectations. I've got a friend of mine who will be listening to the episode. He's a big-time skeptic here, but he doesn't know what I'm going to be proposing. Big-time skeptic on this particular concern. All right, so here's the words of Bart Ehrman. "There is no way this can be historically correct," referring to the census. "There was no worldwide or even empire-wide census in the days of Augustus, let alone a census in which everyone in the Roman Empire had to register in the town that their ancestors had come from 1,000 years earlier, as I explain in another context." He's referring to his book, Jesus Interrupted, where he goes into a little bit more detail here. This is from Did Jesus Exist? He continues on, "And certainly no such census could have happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, as Luke claims, if Jesus was born when Herod was king. Quirinius did not become governor until 10 years after Herod's death." So this comes from Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist?, which I will hold up right here so you can see this. And then he also refers to other contexts that he writes on the subject from Jesus Interrupted right here. Pages 29 to 39, if I'm remembering correctly. Not all 10 pages are devoted to that issue, but that is the section where he deals with, I think, the infancy narrative difficulties. So, you've got those two books by Ehrman, where he writes on the subject. He's given a number of interviews I've seen on YouTube where he talks, there's no evidence here, and you do have what seems to be a textual conflict. Well, what's the textual conflict? Well, it's this. Herod dies in 4 BC. Quirinius was governor of Syria in AD 6 or 6 CE, Common Era. Common Era is the way that liberal scholars prefer to not say in the year of our Lord. So Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, they go with Common Era. Now, if you ever want to just kind of annoy certain types of scholars, you might say, well, what is the Common Era based off of? It's the same time scale. It's still based roughly around Jesus' birth. Okay, so I prefer sticking to the traditional route of AD. You will see that throughout the PowerPoint. If you're watching this video, if you're listening, I'll do my best to convey all the points on the PowerPoint, but it's here to keep some engagement and interest and for folks to reflect on what's being written here. I had breakfast with a fellow several weeks ago. He had printed up, I guess he had taken screenshots because I'm not sure if I made the PowerPoint available offline. He must have taken screenshots of the YouTube videos. That's all right. So we have an issue because we've got the death of Herod in 4 BC, and in AD 6, Quirinius becomes governor of Syria. So how do we reconcile this tension, a conflict, perhaps even a contradiction? Well, here have been the traditional proposed solutions. Oh, but before I jump into that, well, we can go over that, then I'll share the Robert Stein quote from Jesus the Messiah, his work. So here are traditional routes. First, maybe Josephus, who serves as the source of the information for dating Quirinius' governorship of Syria. Maybe it was Josephus who got the dates wrong. So that's one possibility. That's the route John Calvin takes. And, of course we know Luke is accurate. So maybe Josephus was the one who got the dates wrong. Or maybe we could hypothesize that Quirinius was governor twice. Now, we actually have, through archaeological excavation, discovered an inscription that we will look at later that talks about a certain official becoming the governor of Syria twice. So we'll get into that. Maybe there's a translation issue at play here, specifically that this was the first registration before Quirinius was governor of Syria. So maybe it's not when, but maybe it should be translated as before. All right, here's a fourth option. This is the option that Bart Ehrman would take, and I use the word possibly. Luke made an error. Maybe Luke's gospel's wrong. All right, that's a logical possibility. Fifth, ... Maybe there's some other one out there. And here's where maybe we could share this passage from Robert Stein, Jesus the Messiah. He says this: "From our discussion, it is evident that there are a number of problems concerning the reference to the census of Quirinius in Luke 2. Has Luke committed a colossal historical blunder?" And he goes through possible ways of solving this. But here's what he concludes. He says, "Thus, even apart from the question of divine inspiration," we're not dealing with whether this is theologically accurate, divinely inspired. We just want to know historically, is this realistic? Thus, even apart from the question of divine inspiration, it is probably wisest at this point to acknowledge the difficulty of what Luke says, but to hold off calling this a clear error. Perhaps in the future, additional evidence may become available that will explain the present difficulty. Well, I really like Stein's intellectual humility here, saying maybe further evidence will come to light in the future. This prophetic statement will be fulfilled some 25 years later with the publication of Sabine Huebner's work published by Cambridge University Press, Papyri and the Social World of the New Testament. And in this work, Sabine looks at Egyptian papyri in order to learn more about what census taking was like in this specific chapter. So she deals with other issues as well in the book. I specifically looked at her chapter on the census, and she was looking and researching at census records that have survived through time to see what we can learn. And does it sound realistic, what Luke has written here? And how do we solve the dating issue? We're going to get into that. So, a lot of what I'm going to say comes from Huebner's chapter, okay? I'm not taking any original research here. I'm not taking any credit. She gets the credit. Here's the book. Again, the chapter is worth the price of the book. And what I'm going through here is roughly an outline with a few tidbits here and there. There's even more of her research in that chapter than I have time to go through with the PowerPoint with you today. So there are two streams of information that we need to be aware of as we look at this analysis. There's Roman history. What can we learn of Roman history from extra-biblical sources? And then there's also specifically the Egyptian papyri we'll look at. So she pulls from two streams, brings them together to present an extremely plausible solution to this. And it doesn't require us to theorize really the existence of, something that strikes us as highly implausible. So let's start with her analysis of Roman history. What can we learn from censuses from Roman history? Well, we know that censuses of Roman citizens were held at regular 5-year intervals. Augustus conducted provincial censuses in every part of the empire. Okay, so even if there were an imperial census, the way that it would be taken out, the way that it would be performed was at different intervals. So it would be very hard to do it all at once. So you had to do it in segments. And that was especially the case with provincial censuses. So that would occur in every part of the empire. So you would do your imperial census of all the Roman citizens. You would do provincial censuses of provinces. And you would also do censuses of client states. Now, what is a client state? A client state is a sovereign nation, it's a country, that would receive, say, the military defense from a superior, larger nation. A very common example of this today, right now in the year 2024, you have the war in Ukraine, the Russians have attacked Ukraine. There's this nation to the west of Russia that is essentially a puppet state. You might say a client state, and that nation is Belarus, which receives a lot of protection from Russia. They're on friendly terms, extremely friendly terms. Russia even sent some of the troops to attack Ukraine through Belarus. But technically, Belarus is its own country. It's its own nation. So it is not a province of Russia. It is in a sense, it is a client state of Russia, functionally. So that would be an example. And historically, we can look at Roman history when there are client states that use the services of the Roman Empire to perform the census. So Archelaus II in AD 36 is an example of a client state king who conducts a census and uses the administrative support of the Roman Empire. Okay, we also have here on page 35, Huebner writes, ordered by the emperor, if no special legati or procurators were dispatched to oversee them, keep that in mind, they were conducted by governors by means of an edict. So if there was no special legati or procurators, procurator was like an agent, you might today think of a lieutenant governor. I think the analogy of a present-day lieutenant governor for us Americans, right? We have governors of each state. We also have lieutenant governors who serve functions for the state government. So, lieutenant governors, that would be a rough equivalent of a procurator. All right, so let's continue on here. Provincial censuses held at different times throughout the empire. So this is all information we can glean from Roman history. It doesn't require even special research of papyri here yet to be translated into English. This is just pick up some history books and learn about Roman history from sources on how censuses were performed, and we can learn this sort of stuff. Now, here's some cool tidbits from the Egyptian papyri that she researched. This was, I think, maybe her doctoral research, I'm not sure. Published in 2019, Cambridge University Press. genuine, unique research being shared with the world here. So what she looked at was census records, large and small, and the small details included personal details, including not only heads of households, who's in your family, what are their ages, but what are your religious beliefs? What languages do you speak? And do you have any physical features like a scar on your left hand? Why was this important? Well, today we have identification cards. Back then, there were no identification cards, so they had to provide details and information in order for the government officials to be able to recognize that you were a certain person. And so these personal features, physical features, would be a way of identifying yourself. Now, if you lied in your records, your registration, there was a heavy penalty. And the penalty, according to the Egyptian papyri here, was 25% of your assets would be confiscated. Amazing. That's a heavy tax. Very heavy tax. But what's unique about this research is it gets us such a close detail. These are not the official record books of, say, Thucydides' take on what happened in history or Josephus's take. These are the grunt work papers that she is analyzing of the census records. And you could go, back in the day, you could go and look at these archives, like how every nation sort of has a set of archives. The local provinces and the imperial, the empire, they kept these archives, kept these records. And we'll see some quotes from Christian apologists on these records soon towards the end of our PowerPoint today. Okay, now, so her research looks at these meticulous records of the census. We have a tricky, perplexing issue that Ehrman shares about, boy, it really seems nonsensical that someone would be required to go back to their ancestral home. That just seems implausible. And in fact, Ehrman says here, he says, there's no way this can be historically correct. There was no worldwide census in the days of Augustus, let alone a census in which everyone in the Roman Empire had to register in the town that their ancestors had come from 1,000 years earlier, as I explained in another context. So this is just such a far-fetched claim by Luke. But what if we found evidence from Egyptian papyri that mentioned requirements of returning to one's ancestral home? Would that maybe change Ehrman's tone on the subject, if not altogether his view on the subject? Let's look at Huebner's piece here. And I took this picture straight out of the book because this is the token line on this issue of returning to one's ancestral home. We know from the tax lists that have survived on papyrus that everybody had to register in the place where they lived. Okay, yep, we get it. That's common. Very easy. People's places of residence and the places where they owned property were normally identical. But when somebody also owned property elsewhere, such as land or houses, perhaps an inheritance which was now let out, we would say rent, let out to tenants or unoccupied, he also had to travel to that location to declare what he owned there himself. So you already have one reason. If someone owns land somewhere else, they got to go travel to register that land. Moreover, several decades ago, she continues writing, a papyrus came to light in Egypt which showed that some people were indeed required to return home and register in the place where their families lived. The document in question is an edict issued in Alexandria by the prefect of Egypt in 104 CE. End quote. So we have hard evidence from a census performed in Egypt where the prefect gave certain categories of people, and people who were, everybody had to return here. Here are the exceptions. Here are the exemptions. Except these people, you've got to return back to your ancestral homes. Now, these workers were primarily rural or agricultural workers. But nevertheless, textual evidence of the requirement of certain people to return back to their ancestral home. So Huebner concludes this about Luke's description, that it, quote, seems thoroughly realistic if one accepts that his intent was to leave his readers with the impression that Joseph's family was originally from Bethlehem and owned some property there, end quote. Seems thoroughly realistic, that it's not so far-fetched because Joseph simply had to meet one of two qualifications if we were to apply those same Egyptian standards from the Galilean or Judean standards, okay? And we're going to get into that trickiness because you've got two separate subregions. So the two conditions were you had to meet one of two, that you owned some land there and you had to go claim it, or that you were a rural worker and you had to return back to your homeland simply to report for the purposes of the census. So, I see we've got some commenters here. We've got the Church of Bread and Cheese, nice name. It's probably not historical along with the slaughter of innocents. It has a theological purpose, not a historical, just like the slaughter, which shows us Jesus is the new Moses. God bless. Church of Bread and Cheese. What I'm arguing here is that it actually is historical, and we're making the plausible historical case here on today's episode that the census really did occur, and it really occurred when Herod was king, and when Quirinius was, well, we'll get into that. Okay, so let's move on. So we've found high plausibility for the purpose of returning to one's ancestral hometown. Okay, so that's sort of a small obstacle that's now overcome. The larger issue is the dating. The dating still doesn't make sense. Herod dies in 4 BC, and in AD 6, Quirinius becomes governor of Syria. Well, maybe Quirinius was governor on 2 separate occasions. And there's a tomb inscription that was discovered, which describes a man, we don't know who, but it describes a man who had been proconsul in Asia Minor, and then twice governor of Syria. So, Christian apologists have rung the bell here, a resounding bell, saying, ding, 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 we've got it. Here we've got archaeological confirmation that Quirinius was governor twice of Syria. Okay, there is a problem, though. This archaeological discovery could be describing one of 3 people who fit that description: Quirinius, Silvanus, or Piso. That all 3 of these guys meet those qualifications. Shucks, we are at an impasse. And maybe we just can't figure it out. So the archaeological evidence, while a little bit helpful, it's corroborating in one sense, but it's not really confirming. Maybe we have to look elsewhere. And we can look elsewhere. One possibility is to look at what other earlier writers wrote about the tax records. So what if we were to look at, say, Christian apologists from that earlier era and see what they say? Well, here you have Justin Martyr. He says, now there is a village in the land of the Jews, 35 stadia from Jerusalem, in which Jesus Christ was born, as you can ascertain also from the registers of the taxing made under Cyrenius, your first procurator in Judea. Well, that's interesting. That's not quite saying the same thing. Interesting. So this is saying something different. But note here what's occurring is that Justin refers to Cyrenius as a procurator, who is the official undertaking the taxing that occurred. So you can look at these registers from this guy. So here Justin refers to Cyrenius, the first procurator in Judea. Okay? let's continue on here. Tertullian says, now there is a village in the land of the Jews. Let's see here. Yep. Oh, we've got the wrong quote here from Tertullian. Let me look it up here, right here in the book. Huebner writes, perhaps consulting Tertullian can offer a solution. In or around 208. Oh, I simply doubled up here. I see. Okay, so I doubled up. We've got the Tertullian quote. Before we get there, so you've got Justin's apology, who he looks at Cyrenius as first procurator. Now, we can look at Roman history and see how there is corroboration of other procurators overseeing census work. So we have archaeological inscriptions of procurator ad census, so it's procurator to the census, in Cappadocia and Armenia. And we also have a procurator ad census in the region of Panani. All right, so you have archaeological inscriptions, even if we don't know the names of these folks, who were procurators that performed census work. They were the census czar, right? We might refer to, especially in America, it sort of carries negative connotation, someone who is the energy czar, CZAR. They're supposed to oversee this work, that person. Energy, education, border czar, this and that. So you had procurators who were beneath the governor who oversaw this work. So now here's a quote from Tertullian. Around AD 208, he says, also it is well known that a census had just been taken in Judea by Sentius Saturninus, and they might have inquired of his ancestry in those records. That's in his work against Marcion. So note here that Tertullian references who was in charge of Judea. Now we know from Josephus's own records, so he's a closer source, Josephus is a closer source than Tertullian, that Saturninus was governor of Syria from AD 9 to AD 6. Well, why is that important? Well, we know that Augustus issued an imperial-wide census in 8 BC. 8 BC. So we're going to get a timeline here. But in 8 BC, you have it declared that there's going to be an empire-wide census. Okay, so let's take a few steps back. Why does Justin mention Cyrenius? It's because that's the current day procurator, okay? And you have here then Tertullian mentioning, it's the current, let's see here, registered from the made under, so that's the historical reference, so current in that first century BC. So he is saying, Justin is saying, Cyrenius was procurator of Judea. The governor of Judea was, according to Tertullian, Sentius Saturninus. Okay? And he was the governor of Syria. So you've got procurator Cyrenius in Judea, and you have the governor of Syria. So you've got this little crossover happening from Syria into Judea. Well, what explains that? Recall what I said earlier about the client state model, how one nation would receive support from elsewhere. So the Belarusians receive support from Russia. Likewise, the Judeans, especially if you had an empire-supplied governor like Herod, would be seeking the support of a northern nation to conduct this census, especially if it was an empire-wide mandate. So we're starting to get our timeline correct here. We're starting to see other figures as well. Now, Tertullian says that Saturninus would have supported this census, and Josephus says that Saturninus was governor of Syria. But wait a second. Luke mentions Quirinius is the governor of Syria. Now you really have a quandary here, because you can't have two governors at the same time. So the issue here is maybe a textual one again. Because does Luke really mean that Quirinius was governor of Syria? Now, before we look into that question again, looking at the text, let's make a close observation, which I think is pretty neat, from an apologetic little factoid, if you will. Huebner writes, Justin and Tertullian both highlight, independently of one another, that the documents from the census relating to the family of Jesus were available for consultation in the Roman archives. If this had been untrue, it would have been an incredible claim to make in light of the ease with which documents in the archives could be retrieved and consulted. Isn't that amazing? If you had lived in the 1st or 2nd century, you could have consulted the census archives and have looked at the birth records of Jesus of Nazareth. That's pretty sweet. And I hope we discover those records someday. I hope they're buried deep in the sands and preserved from the weather 2,000 years later. I think that's pretty darn neat. Okay, back to the textual issue. Luke says that Quirinius was governor of Syria, right? Not so fast. Let's look at the Greek here. This is the interlinear, which any non-Greek reader can analyze. If you know basics of English grammar, you can decipher, you can look at how the Greek grammar functions. You can see here that the word used is not a noun, it's a verb. This word that says was governor of Syria, that's not a literal translation. As a verb, the word says was governing. Was governing. So, when you look at that textual issue, a translation issue, all of a sudden, you have what's an extremely plausible answer here. Because we know Quirinius was governor of Syria in AD 6, but it's extremely likely that before he was governor, he held some other previous position in the government, such as a procurator. And procurators, as my analogy is, a lieutenant governor, as a simple agent, those people govern. It's what they do. That's their job. So the governor was to oversee military issues, administration issues, and procurators, as we looked from other ancient sources, archaeological evidence, other Roman, histories, we know that procurators undertook the work of the census. So Huebner's translation of Luke 2:2, this was the first registration when Quirinius was procurator of Syria. It's a simple solution that in the 1st decade BC, Quirinius was a procurator, helping the client state of Judea to undertake the census work. Now, the way I would translate Luke 2:2 is to retain the verb form a bit more clearly for people. This was the first census when Quirinius was governing Syria. Now, why is this important? This was the first census, because everybody knew about the second census. The second census was when he was governor. And this was when you have a revolt that occurred, and the revolt, which was spearheaded by a fellow named Judas, not Judas Iscariot, a different Judas. This was the revolt that ultimately led to the culmination of the temple being destroyed in AD 70. So everybody knew about that second census, which is why Luke says this was the first census. So you have here some time markers. You have descriptions of events that help us to piece together what exactly happened. Now let's look at this. I hope the text isn't too small here. It might be. My apologies. But here's basically our timeline. Augustus declares an imperial-wide census in 8 BC. This is indisputable. This is an unquestionable fact of Roman history right here. Herod the Great, who dies in 4 BC, he's running a client state in Judea. He carries out the order with the assistance of Sentius Saturninus. I've got a spelling mistake in my PowerPoint there. He's the governor of Syria. The governor delegates the work to his procurator, which was common, as we know from Roman history and archaeological evidence. And who is his procurator at the time? It's Quirinius. So Quirinius, sometime between 8 and 6 BC, undertakes the census work in Judea and Syria, perhaps, because they all have got to follow the edict. And you had roughly a year and a half time to fulfill that work, just like with the American census today. It's something that takes a year to do, to perform, where the workers go door to door even. Some of us hate when they do that. And they've got to try to count how many people live in each household so we can get population estimates. So it reflects not only the taxing authority and power, which is why it occurred under the Roman time, but so we can calculate congressional districts in each state and how many congressional districts there will be represented in the nation's capital. So it takes time to perform that, to undertake that work. So again, here's the timeline. 8 BC, Augustus declares an imperial-wide census. Herod the Great says, all right, now there was some drama that had occurred between them, according to Huebner, but he had to follow the edict. So to do this, though, he needs some assistance. So he gets the assistance from, as a client state, he gets the assistance from a Roman province up north, Syria. So this is a plausible solution, and it doesn't require the creation of ad hoc theories. It's fully compatible with what we know from historical evidence. Amber, yeah, sorry, the yellow is hard to read. It says, placing the date of Jesus' birth between 8 to 6 BC. Now, here's what's interesting about that time range. So now we know from Josephus that Saturninus was governor of Syria from 9 to 6. We don't need to include 9 there because we know that the edict, the imperial-wide edict, was in 8 BC. So we have just a couple years, 3-year time span that fits. Now, what's also intriguing about this time frame is that it's compatible with Herod's slaughtering of the infants in Matthew's infancy narrative. Because here's how it's compatible. Herod dies 4 BC. So you have a couple years, potentially, from 6 to 4, when this event could have occurred. And it allows for not just a baby, but a young boy, a little boy. Now, I think that event, my personal take on that, while we're not devoting our time here on that today, my personal take is that was a localized event. You have the astronomers or the astrologers, following the Star of Bethlehem. So I think it was more of a localized thing rather than a larger event. And Herod was also crazy, so he did all sorts of things that seemed to fit the bill with, hey, let's go kill the infants from that town. That seems quite compatible with how he operated. At any rate, back here to Luke's census, this is a plausible timeline of events that would have occurred and is fully compatible with Luke's account in Luke chapter 2, that the better translation is either that Quirinius was procurator or that he was governing, not that he was governor. And that translation issue does away with the dating concerns because we're no longer looking at AD 6 and onward, when there was another census that occurred in Syria and led to a revolt. We're not talking about that second census. We're talking about the first census, which occurred sometime between 8 and 6 BC. Fully compatible. It's evidence-based. Huebner's work, I think, is great on this. Not only is her knowledge of Roman history documented and cited and sourced, but she pulls on genuine, authentic research from studying Egyptian papyri and looks at what we can know about the census work. And it makes sense of the return to the ancestral home. You'll recall there were two conditions. If you owned property there, or if you were a rural worker, you had to return to your ancestral home. If Joseph simply met one of those two qualifications, then he would have had to return home. And Luke says that he was of the line of David, so he's returning home to his family, to the broader family. When I was younger, in my 20s, I lived abroad for a year. Then I returned to Chicagoland, which is my ancestral home. This is where my parents both are from. It's where their parents are from, and so on and so forth. Chicagoland has been the ancestral home of my family. So now with air travel, I think people are, far more spread out these days compared to previous eras. But I think it's entirely plausible here. Unlike what Bart Ehrman presents as seemingly this far-fetched idea. There's just no evidence of this. Well, that's a conclusion based on some faulty assumptions of his. And I would certainly welcome Bart to make a reply here. And specifically, I would ask this. Does Luke 2:2 say that Quirinius was governor of Syria? Yes or no? The answer is no. It says he was governing. Let's just take the text for what it says. I know Bart reads Greek. I can read a little Greek. I can do the work. And then let's look at Roman history. What do we know about censuses? We have a great solution here that doesn't require jumping through hoops. So I would love to see what you think. Does this overcome the issues that are plagued by the dating? If we recognize Quirinius's second census as the major one that he undertook, this was the first census when he was procurator, because that's something procurators did. I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but I'm trying to hammer the point home here, that a procurator undertook the work, and Quirinius was a procurator before he was governor. So it doesn't require us to propose that he was governor twice. It just simply, and more likely, allows us to recognize that as he made his way up the corporate ladder, he did this sort of work before he became governor of Syria. So he did it as procurator, helping a client state. So, is Luke's census historical? Yes, it is historically plausible that Quirinius was procurator of Syria between 8 and 4 BC. I put 4 there to represent the date required prior to Herod's death, and that he was the census czar. So that's my solution that I would hold. And again, it's based on Sabine Huebner's research here, which I think is stellar. And I strongly recommend this book, and I will fight tooth and nail. I could be wrong, of course. It's good to have intellectual humility. I could be wrong, but I do think it's the best defense that I have seen. And yeah. So I would welcome pushback. I welcome skeptics to say, no, here's why this doesn't make sense. Tell me how it's not historically plausible. Where is the contradiction? If Quirinius was merely governing, I think that really outdoes the big concern, the big objection on the dating. So you have the two issues. The far-fetched idea of returning to the ancestral home is the smaller one. The larger one is the dating. And I think Huebner has solved both of those based on her knowledge of the Roman era, Roman history, and her primary research looking at Egyptian papyri census records. That sounds super boring, but I'm so glad that she did it. Someone has to look at those census records, and I'm really appreciative of the work that she's done here. Maybe I'll have to set up an interview with her and to ask her if there's been any pushback on her view. Great. All right. So thank you. That's really all that I've had for today's program. I wanted to overview this. I know, it's already been 45 minutes. I felt like that went quite quickly, and we didn't even take our break. That's okay. I went through all of our material that I wanted to go through today, and let me take you back to Stein's quote here. Let me pull it up here. Robert Stein, he wrote, "Thus, even apart from the question of divine inspiration, it is probably wisest at this point to acknowledge the difficulty of what Luke says, but to hold off calling this a clear error. Perhaps in the future, additional evidence may become available that will explain the present difficulty." Huebner's analysis of Egyptian papyri does just that. Further evidence has come to light. We know more about how census work, registration work occurred. And we can see how, I'm happy to say that there are assumptions being made here. But one assumption is that the same sort of principles about that registration work that occurred in Egypt applied in other parts of the Roman Empire. I think that's a safe assumption to make. And if that's the case, we do have evidence of workers returning to ancestral home based on a number of conditions. So great job by Huebner for looking into that and for her knowledge of Roman history. All right, well, that does it for the show today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks who just chip in a few dollars each month. We would love your monthly partnership here at Veracity Hill to build this sustainable ministry effort of creating content each week as best we can. Sometimes I take the week off if needed. But as you can see here, this even just this PowerPoint and the research took time to look at the issue, to delve into high-level scholarship published by Cambridge University Press, to condense it down, bullet points, that sort of thing takes time. And it takes effort as well. We've got workers who are helping to produce the graphics, the technical production. So I'm thinking Gabe and Mark, their ongoing help. So your support in becoming a monthly partner of our ministry helps to pay these ministry, these laborers, these ministry workers of ours here at Veracity Hill and at Defenders Media 501c3. I'm also thankful for the sponsors that we have: Defenders Media, Apologetics 315, and Rethinking Hell. And I want to thank Gabe, our technical producer, and our media associate, Mark, for their fine work, and other workers at Defenders who help me think through Veracity Hill things like Beth and Dante and Kyle. I'm ever appreciative of them and their work here for the program. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening and for watching in as we strive for truth on the historicity of Luke's census.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.